गुड आफ्टरनून एव्हरीवन. पण नेक्स्ट पार्ट बघणार आहेत बायोडायव्हर्सिटी. ओके, आणि त्याच्यावरचे व्हिडिओ आहेत. बायोडायव्हर्सिटी म्हणजे काय, त्याचे टाइप्स काय काय आहेत ऍक्च्युअली व्हिडिओ बघितल्यावरच तुम्हाला क्लिअर होईल. त्यासाठी मी आज व्हिडिओ दाखवेन, कारण पीपीटी मध्ये जे एक्सप्लेनेशन आहे ते ऍक्च्युअल व्हिडिओ मध्ये तुम्हाला म्हणजे लवकर समजेल. आणि अजून एक आयएससी चे तुमचे टाइम टेबल्स आलेले आहेत. 1 जुलै पासून आयएससी स्टार्ट आहेत, आयएससी 1. तो सगळ्यांनी स्टडी स्टार्ट करा सगळ्या सब्जेक्टचे. ओके, ईएस ला वगैरे आयएससी वगैरे नाहीये, फक्त आयसीटी ला आहे 50 मार्क्स. ओके, 50 मार्काचा आयसीटी जो तुम्हाला स्प्रेडशीट मध्ये एमसीक्यू टाकलेला आहे 2 चॅप्टरवर, तेच असणार आहे. आयसीटी रिलेटेड मी सांगते, पण ईएस ला नाहीये एक्झाम वगैरे. नंतर लेक्चर नंतर टाइम टेबल वगैरे बघा, ग्रुपवर सेंड केलेले तुम्हाला. नेक्स्ट पार्ट आहे ते बायोडायव्हर्सिटी. बायो म्हणजे लाईफ, डायव्हर्सिटी म्हणजे व्हरायटी. म्हणजे व्हरायटी ऑफ लिव्हिंग स्पेसिस कुठले अर्थ मध्ये इन्क्लूड्स आहेत, प्लांट्स, अॅनिमल, बॅक्टेरिया, फंगी. त्या रिलेटेड एक 4-5 व्हिडिओ आहेत. आणि लास्ट लेक्चरला नॅचरल रिसोर्सेस वगैरे झालेले, त्याचे एक शॉर्ट आज लेक्चर मध्ये व्हिडिओ दाखवेन मी, कारण तुम्हाला कन्सेप्ट पूर्ण क्लिअर होतील. बायोडायव्हर्सिटी तर सगळ्यांना माहित आहे, तरी एकदा व्हिडिओ मध्ये तुम्हाला क्लिअर होऊन जाईल. दिसतंय सगळ्यांना व्हिडिओ? हॅलो
मॅडम, काहीच दिसत नाही, पूर्ण ब्लॅक स्क्रीन आहे.
व्हिडिओज नाही दिसत?
नाही दिसत मॅम.
बेटा आता दिसते?
नो मॅम, नाही दिसत.
बेटा एकच मिनिट हा.
Bio.Diversity. Bio.Diversity. Bio.Diversity
दिसतंय का? हॅलो, दिसतंय का व्हिडिओ सगळ्यांना? मी स्टॉप केले, पण दिसतंय का सगळ्यांना स्क्रीनवर?
येस मॅम, येस.
Bio.Diversity.
ह्यामध्ये 3 टाइप्स आहेत, जेनेटिक, स्पेसिस आणि इकोसिस्टीम. त्याचे पण मी दाखवेन. व्यवस्थित बघा सगळ्यांनी व्हिडिओ.
Biodiversity is the variety of animals and plants found on this planet, including the geographic locations they are found in. The diversity of species is not evenly distributed throughout the planet because life depends on many factors, including geography. For example, tropical regions support more life than polar regions. Plants, animals, and climate work together to maintain the balance of nature. They act as nuts, bolts, and oil of a perfectly tuned machine. The pyramid of nature's balance. Biodiversity is important for sustaining life on Earth because it prevents any one species from throwing the balance of nature out of order. Snakes are not a welcome presence in our lives, so we fear them and try to get rid of them. One of the many things that snakes feed on is rats. If we were to kill all the snakes, we would end up having a terrible rat problem. Biodiversity means maintaining the balance of nature so that no one thing can become too powerful and therefore bad for everyone else.
Biodiversity is a term Biodiversity is a term that represents the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense, which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across one
व्हिडिओ दिसतंय का स्क्रीनवर?
Biodiversity is a term that represents
Yes, ma'am.
ओके ओके.
the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense, which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across 1/3 of the land surface to lock away carbon and keep the climate stable. We need millions of pollinators and billions of soil organisms and megatons of plankton to keep the food we eat in supply. We need strange plants deep in jungles to create our medicines, and coral reefs and mangrove swamps to protect the coasts we depend upon. Our planet's biodiversity provides all the things we need for free. But it will only do so if there's lots of it, and at the moment it's under attack. In the last 50 years, our activities have dramatically reduced biodiversity across the globe. We've snuffed out habitats, reduced populations of wild animals by 60%, and even driven whole species extinct. The number of lions in Africa has dropped by 65%. The number of individual flying insects in Europe has dropped by 75%. The number of bluefin tuna in the Pacific has dropped by 95%. Biodiversity is dropping everywhere and fast. This is catastrophic for nature and therefore ourselves. We talk about climate change a lot, but biodiversity loss is as important an issue. How do we stop this loss of life? How do we ensure that biodiversity, our planet's vital statistic, begins to increase again? In fact, we already know exactly what to do. Follow our planet.
Feast your eyes.
टाइप्स आहेत बायोडायव्हर्सिटी मध्ये जेनेटिक बायोडायव्हर्सिटी.
On these painted ladies, an apt name for a butterfly so vibrant.
Butterflies and moths constitute 10% of all known biodiversity in terms of numbers of species, and they really display in front of us a rich canvas of colors and patterns on their wings.
With support from the National Science Foundation, developmental biologist Arno Martin and a team at George Washington University are using cutting-edge genomic techniques to better understand how the rich stripes and swirls of a butterfly's wing take their shape.
The swing patterns are used in nature for camouflage, avoiding predators, signaling toxicity, and also to find mates. So we know why they are so diverse, but now the question, I would say, is to understand how it happens. How do you create such an explosive diversity during a deep evolutionary time?
The team uses the genome editing tool called CRISPR, which cuts DNA at targeted locations, like a pair of molecular scissors.
The way we use CRISPR here in this lab, it's simply to make little snips in the genome to modify genes, and then we see what is going wrong during butterfly development, and it's sometimes translated into some modification of the wing patterns.
They start by gathering eggs, these little blue spheres. Once they get them all lined up under the microscope, each gets a little squirt of CRISPR cocktail. They're trying to knock out what Martin calls the master paintbrush genes, ones they suspect control wing shapes and patterns.
And we say you knock it out, which is very imaginative, right? You have lots of genes in the genome, you take one that you think is important, you knock it out. And you see what happens, what is going wrong. It's like studying maybe how a car is functioning, but you break a little part and you try to understand what's wrong. Is it the wipers that are stopping functioning, the electric system, the engine, and so on?
The eggs hatch into caterpillars, which eventually morph into butterflies. They can actually watch the wing patterns take shape every step of the way. When unexpected shapes emerge, they know they found a master switch.
Sometimes the effect can be a little bit predicted based on the way the gene is expressed during wing development. When the wing is growing in the caterpillar, in the larva, the genes are already expressed in territories that are the future wing patterns. So sometimes the master switch gene we're interested in, for instance, is expressed as a stripe. And when we see that, we predict that, if we remove the gene, there is something looking like this stripe that is going to be gone. And very often, it has happened.
It's not all about butterflies. Variations on the same master genes are also found in the genomes of many animals, driving the development of the shapes and the colors that make each kind unique.
So this master switch, this master paintbrush gene, if you want, is of particular interest because we know that in the genome around this gene there is a lot of genomic change that is shaping biodiversity. We really want to dissect that at the molecular level, go after the little details that really create novelty during evolution.
Looking to butterflies to understand the genomics of biodiversity. For Science Nation, I'm Miles O'Brien.
At first glance, it might seem that introducing new species, the human act of
Second type species diversity.
taking species from somewhere else and dropping them in a different area would be good for biodiversity. Let's face it, if you take a bunch of beautiful flowers and plant them in your garden, you're increasing the biodiversity in your garden, right? You raise the species richness in your garden. But it's not a simple additive equation. It's more complicated than that. The term introduced species is synonymous with exotic species. The definition is any species that, through the activities of humans, is knowingly or accidentally transferred from its native habitat into one in which it doesn't naturally occur. An introduced species is the opposite of a native species, which is one that occurs in an area naturally, without human intervention. Many introductions are intentional. We do it on purpose, and we've been doing that for a heck of a long time, probably ever since humans came onto the scene and realized that they could pick something up that was alive and bring it somewhere else to serve their purposes. From goats and pigs to cattle and crops. Mostly we transport organisms that will do some good for us through agricultural means. We've been introducing plants and animals to places where they weren't native for a long, long time. Usually when people think about introduced species, they're really thinking more about the accidental ones, the things that happen coincidentally alongside human activities. When we introduce a species to a new area, everything that's living on, in, or with that species comes along with it. If you pick up a cow from one place and move it to another, it's going to bring along all the parasites that those cows normally deal with. I think people immediately picture images of rats streaming off the ships when they pull into some beautiful Tahitian paradise, or the snakes that came into Guam with military movements during World War II. These animals are legendary in doing damage to native birds. They're very obvious ways that introduced organisms radically change biodiversity in a single place. There are so many other subtle ways that introductions happen and cause problems. The bottom line is that the world economy is hit with an annual cost of $1.4 trillion dealing with the negative impacts, obvious and not so obvious, of introduced species. That's a number I have a hard time wrapping my mind around. If you had an extra $1.4 trillion to play around with, there's a lot of possibility to do some good in the world. Because humans have been introducing new species for a long time, the concept of native habitat is a little bit slippery. The human activities that cause the transfer can happen long before we recognize that it actually happened. So that sometimes the history of an introduction can be lost. When we aren't sure of the history, up until the point we are sure or have some reasonable evidence, we call those species cryptogenic. Crypto means hidden. Genic means origin. Solving the riddles of cryptogenic species underscores another reason why collections are so important. The only way to trace the origins of introductions is to know what was there beforehand. Collections can preserve that historical information, and collections made today establish baselines for future reference. If those collections are maintained in perpetuity, those baselines are going to be good 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now when we see a radically different and altered environment due to the introductions. So we can use collections to try and get answers to this problem. Not all species are, in fact, harmful. Clearly, they're not all harmful to us because the ones that we introduce on purpose are ones that are there for our benefit. Some introduced species can provide new food sources or even habitats for native species. Native species aren't always helpless and harmed. They can make use of some of the newcomers. Introduced grasses and corn, for example, are eaten by native species, and certain trees that have been introduced can serve as habitats for birds. Some introduced species live under our radar. We don't even know they're there, doing little perceivable damage to the ecosystem by reducing species richness. But some introduced species certainly go beyond just living peacefully alongside the natives. They can do this because they have competitive advantages. They lack natural controls, such as the predators or diseases that keep them in check in their native habitats. Some invasive species are generalists, which means they can tolerate, reproduce rapidly, and thrive in a wide range of environmental conditions, allowing them to successfully compete with and overwhelm native populations. When introduced species take over an environment at the expense of native species, they're known as invasive species. All invasive species are introduced, but not all introduced species are invasive. Here's an example of consequences for humans as well as for species richness. In 1992, an introduced species of comb jelly was found in the Black Sea. Comb jellies are weird, transparent, jellyfish-like forms with a voracious appetite for fish larvae and eggs. Within months, that single introduction resulted in the total collapse of the anchovy fishery in the Black Sea. Comb jellies tolerated the conditions in the Black Sea, and their population exploded at the expense of the anchovies. The bottom line here is that introduced species can outcompete the natives for food, for space, and other resources. They alter the ecosystem's food webs, disturbing crucial elements and interactions that would otherwise contribute to healthy ecosystem function. The comb jelly is a good example of that. Sure, your species list for the Black Sea has gone up by 1, but it destroyed all the anchovies. You have to take a species off the list. Plus, perhaps whatever else was eating the anchovies. And before you know it, because there's nothing for the comb jellies to eat anymore, they're gone too. So, not only have you not added a species, but in the end, you've actually subtracted a whole bunch. So invasive species are, ultimately, organisms that cause decreases in ecosystem function. That's another definition of invasives that we need to come to grips with. What's worse, invasives very seldom come by themselves. As I was saying with the cow example, they often come with new diseases, new parasites, new accompanying effects that we can hardly predict. Another good example of invasives are pathogens, something that we don't often consider as invasives. These include disease-causing organisms like fungi or bacteria and even viruses. These are things that we also introduce to wild populations, and there are extinctions that come from that. In fact, in the past 500 years, we've directly caused the extinction of more than 100 species of birds, partly through the introduction of disease, and heck knows what damage we did to organisms that were depending on those birds. In the forest realm, Dutch elm disease was something that, when I was growing up, was a huge thing, and actually it still is. In North America, Dutch elm disease left skeletal trees for miles and miles. When I was a kid growing up in Toronto in the 60s, 80% of the elms in the city were killed, and it was really sad. Those trees were not only gorgeous, they were very important lumber. Elm trees were a direct service to us in so many different ways, from producing shade to furniture. The fungus was introduced by bark beetles, some of which were native and some of which were introduced, both of which supported and co-evolved with the fungal pathogen, which could not be stopped. This idea of being a generalist, the ability to reproduce and displace natives, the ability to become more abundant at the expense of other species, to introduce diseases, to proliferate in non-native habitats, that should sound pretty familiar, because that's us. In some ways, we are the ultimate invasive species. We don't just introduce ourselves, we are invasive. The difference is that, unlike the comb jellies and the bark beetles and cows, we're capable of recognizing that fact and maybe mitigating our impact. We can look at the world and the problems and start thinking about ways to control invasives, to corral them, maybe to reduce their effects, and not introduce them in the first place. We have to, not just for moral reasons, I think, but because, ironically, and as we said earlier, the invasives that we're bringing with us, accidentally or on purpose, can do a lot of harm to species upon which we depend. Worse, they can upset healthy ecological functions upon which all life depends, including us.
बायोडायव्हर्सिटी लॉसेस काय आहेत ते बघा.
Biodiversity. It represents the wealth of all biological resources available to us. Each species, no matter how big or small, has an important role to play in ecosystem. Various plants and animal species depend on each other for what each offers, and these diverse species ensures natural sustainability for all life forms. For instance, human beings are dependent on various plants and animals for their food, shelter, and clothes, and likewise many other species are dependent on each other for such purposes. Richness of biodiversity makes our planet fit for the survival of each of the species living here. Biodiversity. It represents the wealth of all biological resources available to us. Each species, no matter how big or small, has an important role to play in ecosystem. Various plants and animal species depend on each other for what each offers, and these diverse species ensures natural sustainability for all life forms. For instance, human beings are dependent on various plants and animals for their food, shelter, and clothes, and likewise many other species are dependent on each other for such purposes. Richness of biodiversity makes our planet fit for the survival of each of the species living here.
The main cause of the loss of biodiversity can be attributed to the influence of human beings on the world's ecosystem. In fact, human beings have deeply altered the environment and have modified the territory, exploiting the species directly.
Biodiversity depletion is a natural phenomenon, but the present levels of biodiversity depletion are many times higher than the natural rate. Recently, the levels of loss in biodiversity have started causing global concern.
Here are the major reasons that cause biodiversity loss. Overexploitation.
The exploitation of natural resources to the point of diminishing returns has significantly given rise to biodiversity loss. Activities such as overhunting, overfishing, overmining, and excessive logging have greatly reduced biodiversity levels.
Habitat loss. When a habitat is degraded or destroyed as a result of the natural or human activities such as earthquakes, land use, deforestation, or agriculture, biodiversity is lost as the ecological system supporting biological survival is taken away. Even if only a small portion of an ecosystem is destroyed, the entire system's balance becomes vulnerable. Human overpopulation.
Overpopulation has witnessed continued encroachment into frontier forest, heightened pollution, and destruction of natural ecosystems that has considerably contributed to the mass extinction of species. The number of threatened species persists to multiply worldwide, whereas some have completely gone extinct.
Climate change.
When climate change occurs, temperatures can increase dramatically. When temperature rises, many different changes can occur on Earth. It can result in more floods, droughts, or intense rain, as well as more frequent and severe heat waves.
Pollution.
The various forms of pollution, including water pollution, soil pollution, air pollution, land pollution, and agricultural pollution, simply destroy animal and plant habitats due to the toxic substances and chemicals released into the biological system, contributing to their eventual death.
Out of these causes, one that contributes the most damage to biodiversity is pollution, since it connects to the other major reasons of biodiversity depletion. We went to different places in our city to see if these activities that contribute to biodiversity loss are happening in our community.
So niadto mi different places sa Iligan, then first na mo giadtoan kay ang Regs Beach Resort. No, above ocean. Gani, dili ka balo ang tao mo sa. Daghang tao nga nag-happy-happy dito. Dayon, in the end, kay ang nakita lang jud namo kay ang basura. Mga basura nga naglutaw-lutaw, then ang mga bata dito.
Crashes everyone na wala ang hideriga. So, ito, dulod kayo siya do, mag-date-date ang diri mo. Amor, good na o. Nainokit.
Nga to sa kuan, Palao. Dito sa Palao Market. Dito sa Bagsakan Dapit. Dito nakita ni nga grabe kahugaw. Nya bagsakanan to siya sa vegetables, mga fruits.
Dyan kayo siya guys. Ang mga kilid dito sa market, walang trash. So ay pulo sa ani nga malata, di malata. Awang tubig guys, ipaawas rin nila. Punta ka siya sa anak padulong. Sayang ang water. Save water. Naibawal manghihidiri guys then nakalabay naglalaki na nanghihidiri ko. Hoy, baboy!
Ano bastos lagi mo? Anong baboy man?
Hoy, baboy! Ayaw ilabay ang basura din. You thought na limpyo kang kanal, but no. Dang. It's dirty, y'all.
Well, hey. Hey,
It's
boy.
real.
Hey.
Dili ra sa Manila
Hindi siya
ang
kanal, day.
Dili kanal, basurahan
Kanal
eh.
siya, day. Wala na inform basurahan, day.
Kayo ni siya sa among walay discipline. We should assume that
Mga people, di ba gitudlo na
Ears to modern humans have namers. We humans have named ourselves Homo sapiens, meaning wise men. But is man really so wise? Over the years, we've been destroying our earth. Day by day, animals go extinct. Resources are being damaged. And we willingly covered our ears to Mother Nature's screams and closed our eyes to all of her help-wanted signs. That cannot be wisdom. Wisdom knows that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if we were wise, we would not be shocked if we see storms that are stronger than ever before, or more droughts, hurricanes, and wildfires, more pollution, more trees cut down, more diseases and habitat loss. Our world